Okay, so let me just begin by reminding you that we're meeting at the Fowler tomorrow at 12, and we expect to spend 2 hours tomorrow, 1 hour at the Fowler and 1 hour, either in a classroom or outside, more likely outside, since there's no forecast for rain. And during that hour, I'll sort of speak to you for about half an hour, 45 minutes, and the hour is also available for an open discussion. The second thing I want to mention is the mic working? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, so the second thing I want to mention, pointed it out in an email to you, but if anyone wants to meet immediately after class today for lunch, just come up after class, all right? So let me begin by spending a few more minutes on the Communist Manifesto, and then we move to the main subject for today's lecture, which is the European exploration of Africa, the expansion rather, European expansion in Africa, the colonization of Africa, what happened in the Congo, what the Berlin Conference was all about, and what are some of the implications of thinking about the events of the late 19th century moving into the early 20th century. But before we get into all of that, let me just take up a few passages from the Communist Manifesto. So you recall my discussion. I had, in my remarks to you on Wednesday, I had sort of given you a brief history of the circumstances under which the Communist Manifesto came about, the revolutions of 1848. The manifesto appears just before the first onset of those revolutions, and in that sense, you might say that, of course, Marx and Engels were prescient. They had an idea of the kind of turmoil that Europe would go through, and the circumstances were that there was, in all of these countries in Europe, barring a few, there was an aspiration for freedom, that many of the democratic reforms, if one may put it that way, had already fallen through. That is, the ones that were instigated as a consequence of the French Revolution. There had been a reaction, and then what you have is you have the onset of these revolutions, and that's going to lead to another reaction. So the net conclusion, if you really look at the voluminous scholarly work that has been done on the revolutions of 1848, is that most of them, in fact, actually did not really yield any dividends for the working class, for common people. In the ordinary sense of the term, they did not yield any dividends. But you might think to yourself that this is the course of history, really, right? That there is always an impulse towards freedom, towards aspiration, because what is the history of humankind? It's an attempt to constantly free yourself from various kinds of chains. Sometimes those chains are physical, sometimes those chains are, in fact, actually mental. They're almost always mental, even when they're physical, but sometimes, as we have seen from my very brief remarks on prison literature, we know that people who have been imprisoned still felt free in some fundamental sense of the term, at least the ones who were able to rise out of that particular situation, right? So those are the circumstances. And I think that component of it is something that is really transparent in the Communist Manifesto itself, because what is striking to me, of course, is the extraordinary language of the manifesto, the fact that in this short treatise, which, as I have urged you to think about it, is that should be really thought about more as a historical treatise rather than an economic treatise as such. You can think of it, of course, as an attempt to also intervene in what we might describe as the history of economic thought. That's another way to think about it. So it takes its place alongside people such as Adam Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, and then you get somebody like Marx. That would be another way to really locate it. I haven't located it, of course, in the whole history of German philosophy, because it's almost impossible to read Marx, as the scholars will tell you, without having some appreciation of Hegel. Especially the young Marx was deeply indebted to Hegel and to Hegel's whole view of history. So, if you go to something like Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history, where he has huge sections on the ancient world, and he has a section on China, India, and then Europe. And what does he say? He says that there's the spirit Okay, the spirit moves, as it were, and when he says a spirit, it's an expression for the impulse to freedom. It moves, but there are places where it remains stagnant. I'm putting it in very much my own language, of course. Right? So when he's looking at China and India, what he's looking at are what, from his point of view, were stagnant societies. There's a different relationship between society and state in each of these two. They're not identical, but in comparison to Europe, they offer a fundamental difference. Right? Now you can see some of that in Marx, as you can see that in his writings on India, which we had looked at earlier. But here let's just look at a couple of the passages, because he's talking about the modern epoch, that is when he's talking about 1848, and he says that essentially this is a struggle between the bourgeoisie and proletariat. And if you're thinking, by the way, who are the bourgeoisie? I mean, who are the bourgeoisie? It's the middle class. That would be the other way to put it, the enterprising capitalist middle class, right? And you have to distinguish that from the aristocratic elite. Now, there may be areas of overlap there, but you have to distinguish the bourgeoisie from the aristocratic elite. Now, on page 2, or page 220 of this edition, the one that was assigned to you, but page 2 of the actual text, the first section, bourgeois and proletarians, let me just read out that passage, because here you see the prescience of Marx. And you'll see the relationship to Africa, which of course doesn't get any mention over here, but you'll see exactly why it is that the Europeans had to move into Africa. Because when we start to look at the European colonization of Africa, the question we have to fundamentally ask ourselves is, well, why was Europe so interested in Africa? What did they know about Africa? How did they conceive of it? Right? And this is what Marx says. Meantime, the markets keep ever growing, the demand ever rising. And he's writing, of course, in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. Now the Industrial Revolution has hit continental Europe too. I mean, it starts in England. This is 100 years after the onset of the Industrial Revolution in England. It's hit Europe, right? So northern Italy is starting to get more industrialized. There's an interesting little aside here, by the way. In many countries, there's a divide between the north and the south. Sometimes it's the east and the west, but in Europe, for example, you notice that northern Italy is much more industrialized than southern Italy, all right? And you're going to find that to be the case in many of these countries in Europe. So meantime, the markets kept ever growing, the demand ever rising. Even manufacture no longer sufficed. Therefore, steam and machinery revolutionized industrial production. Now, that we saw, right? The steam engine, for example, the place of manufacture was taken by the giant modern industry. The place of the industrial middle class by industrial millionaires, the leaders of whole industrial armies, the modern bourgeois. Modern industry has established the world market, for which the discovery of America paved the way. The world market. So the conception of the world now, no longer in theological terms, in divine terms, in cosmic terms. I mean, this is not the Greeks writing or Dante writing. This is Marx saying, for the bourgeoisie, the world has only one meaning. And that is, it's a market. It's a gigantic market waiting to be opened up, to be explored. Right? And that's what the Amazon marketplace is all about. Everything, every place you can get a reach, you do so. And of course, this should lead us to the recognition of the fact that if you're looking at the most recent phase of capitalism, what we're seeing is that what colonialism really couldn't effect completely, even the reach of colonialism was nothing comparable to the reach of the modern post-industrial giants that we have, such as Google, Amazon, and so on, right? But it's this concept of the market. That is that it knows no end. There's no limit. And of course, by implication, Marx is saying the difference between the bourgeoisie today and those who were in the arena of the public sphere, the difference is that there are no limits to the greed of the bourgeoisie. It's a matter of complete self-aggrandizement. This market has given an immense development to commerce, to navigation, to communication by land. All right? And he continues down. But let me just look at a few more passages
And that will bring an end to our discussion. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. This is the argument of the articles on India that were written a few years later on, right? Because we were trying to understand why is it that Marx, who of course deplores colonialism, is a critic of England, says that its conduct is vile and vicious, nonetheless says that, well, what's happening in India under the British is something that needs to happen, because this is a stagnant, patriarchal society comprised of these despicable village communities living in barbarism and superstition. And the engine of reform that England brings will do something to this terrain, right? It has pitilessly, the bourgeoisie, he's talking about the bourgeoisie, it has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors. That before what you had was you had relations which were between the superiors and inferiors, but there was still some notion of what you might call limits there in that relationship. But now these ties are torn asunder pitilessly, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. That's all that defines the relations between human beings under a regime of the bourgeoisie, is naked money, right? The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. Professors are for sale too. You know, if I get an offer from Harvard, you know, tomorrow, my 25-year loyalty to UCLA all disappears. It just melts. That's what happens. This idea, oh, you know, great reverential occupations, great lawyers, doctors, professors. No, in Marx's view, everyone is for sale, including the Pope, right? That's what he's saying. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborers. And here's this line which every American politician and British and Indian politician who mouth all these pieties about family values, you know, I can choke on this phrase every time I hear it 50 times a day when I hear, you know, Senator McConnell or this or that person, family values, right? This is what he says. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation. You know, this is what Marx set out to do. So you have the whole economic theory, but if you say, hey, I'm not persuaded by the economic theory, the theory of surplus value, or this or that, there is still this element of Marx. You know, the absolute renegade rebel who is giving you these provocations to think through. And that's a spirit, I think, in which you should really be looking at a text such as the Communist Manifesto. All right? Now, we get into the question of Africa. Let's begin with this map. And let me just ask you, and not rhetorically, I'd like to see a couple of you at least venture to say very, very quickly, because we have a lot of terrain to cover, what is striking about this map to anyone? Yes? Okay. You put your finger on it, right? That's what but now the question is, what do we make of that? Okay? You said unexplored region. So what do we make of that? What we make of it is really the following. That, you see, recall what I'd been saying to you about technologies of the state. And we discussed that in several different dimensions. So we looked at, very briefly, such things as statistics, its relationship to the state, the idea of surveillance, the census. You recall my discussion of the census, that we have now entered the region in the 19th century, we have entered a bounded world, right? Where everything is now contained and explained through numbers, the regime of numbers, in the most expansive sense of the term. Right? Now, in the same 19th century, we also have, of course, the development of various other kinds of technologies, such as cartography, which, as I pointed out to you, has an earlier history, of course. It goes back much earlier, several centuries earlier. There are also, in fact, maps which predate what is now called early modern, the early modern period as well. I mean, there are, and it all depends on how one defines a map, by the way, you know, all right? But I'm taking the conventional understanding of a map, and in this conventional understanding, what is extraordinary is it says unexplored region. Now, this should immediately point out to you what? Who is producing this map? If I gave you no further information, it cannot be a resident of that area, someone who is living in that part of the world who is drawing this map. It has to be a European. Because what is it? That huge middle portion is one undifferentiated mass, simply called unexplored. Because if the European hasn't been there, if the European hasn't named it, then it doesn't exist. It's just not there, effectively. If you look at this map here, now this is a different construction, but look at this map. Now you say, okay, here, these are all the modern nation states there. And then you say, yeah, this is the people of Congo, this is the people of Cameroon, etc., etc. And these are the languages they speak. But if you look at this map, it's simply unexplored. Because if the European hasn't put his stamp on it, it has no existence. Right? It's really astonishing, the map, because it tells you so much about the Europeans. It tells you nothing about Africa. And this was partly the argument of Edward Said in his path-breaking book of 1978 called Orientalism, where the argument, which a lot of scholars still contest, but I think the fundamental argument is frankly unimpeachable. And that argument was that the vast corpus of European writings on Africa, on India, on Egypt, tell you very little about these places. They tell you a lot about the European intellectual milieu from which these writers came, and from which these cartographers came, and the travelers, and so on and so forth. Right? But there are other implications that we really need to think through. And I'll begin with an anecdote from 1991, which I've talked about in my book, Empire of Knowledge, but you can track it down on Google very easily. Very easily. In 1991, Lawrence Summers, I don't know if the name rings a bell for most of you. Most of you it will not, perhaps, but for many of you, some of you it may. So Lawrence Summers has had many distinguished careers. You go from being one kind of rascal to being another kind of rascal is how I put it, you know. So he was the second man at the World Bank, okay? The second person in charge of the World Bank. Then he went on to join Clinton's cabinet. Then he became the president of Harvard University, where he made a statement which provoked a lot of controversy, because he said that men are naturally better inclined to be, men are naturally better at sciences than are women. And that's one reason why there aren't that many women in the sciences. Now, we're not going to adjudicate on that issue. But what I am interested in is the fact that when he was at the World Bank in 1991, he wrote a memo, a secret memo which was leaked and published in a journal which was very friendly to him, but even they thought it was a little obnoxious. And what did he say in that memo in 1991? He said that the countries of Africa are dangerously underpolluted. dangerously underpolluted. You know, we have this vast continent. Frankly, the Africans don't know what to do with all the raw materials they have. That's why the pollution levels aren't nearly as high as they should be in a third world country, because, you know, the engines would be cracking, as it were. You know, there would be industry, manufacturing, smoke belching. Well, that shows the country is moving along, you know. Well, there isn't enough factories belching smoke, you know, releasing toxins into the air, because in Africa there isn't enough activity. And then what does he say? He says, I'm a believer in free trade, and I'll tell you what I think free trade would be and how it would work. That Africa should send all its raw materials to us in Europe, and we'll send them our toxic materials, our nuclear waste, our computer waste. He says that. And this would be, he says, free trade, a good exchange of products. Now, Lawrence Summers is no different than any of the beasts, pardon the word, but there's no other word for it, who are described in this book. Exterminate all the brutes, in quotation marks, because it's actual quotation from a European text. All right? He's no different. But my interest is not Summers, because there are millions like him around in the establishment. My interest is in that sensibility. How did they think about Africa then, and how do they think about Africa today? So it is not simply a tale about the late 19th century, any more than this book is a tale about only the late 19th century, because what does he do? He then relates the whole narrative to the Holocaust at the end. That the histories of the Holocaust and the histories of colonialism cannot be separated. Because what fundamentally happened was what Europe had done to everyone else, now it did it to its own people. It brought the Holocaust and the genocide within Europe. The same arguments were actually being used in the late 19th century, and of course much earlier. When you look at the conquest of the Americas, that's not part of what we haven't looked at the 15th, 16th century. We haven't looked at the conquest of the Americas and what they did, the Europeans, the Spaniards, when they came into the Americas. All right? But these arguments have been running through for a period of time, you know. All right? I'll explore the implications in just a moment of this a little further, but let's go back to these maps now. Because 1818, 1913, what you're really seeing is you're seeing two maps which are basically showing what the difference is. And the difference is in part going to be accounted for by the fact that there is going to be what is called the Berlin Conference, which we'll turn to momentarily, and the colonization of Africa, or the phrase that was used. It's a lovely in the sense of being obnoxious, but it's a lovely phrase. The scramble for Africa is what it used to be called. The European powers scrambled, you know, because this was really the only part of the world that was now left, which hadn't been colonized. So everyone's rushing into the game. Of course, France and England had the advantage. They were the dominant colonial powers. And if you see over here, all this in blue, this is the color code tells you here. This slide will be made available, of course, as well. This is all French possessions. And the other big color is this one here, some shade of, I don't know, what is it, brown or pink or some combination, whatever, beige. These are all the possessions of Britain, right? Including, of course, portions of this over here, the top portion of South Africa, Natal, and all of that, right? So what you have is the difference here between these two has to do with what had happened in the intermediate years, and then just so that you can see, if we fill up Africa, as it were, fill up Africa with its political boundaries, you can see the carving up of nation states. And I want you to think through that, because we'll have to think about to what extent are these boundaries at all legitimate, right? How are boundaries actually drawn of nation states? Now, sometimes they may be drawn because you have a geographical boundary that gives you the clue. But very often there is no geographical boundary, right? So how were these boundaries drawn, and with what consequences? And this map, so a series of maps, because this is also a way of thinking about map making and how we use maps to describe the world, to interpret it. And of course, I've spoken to you about cartography. So here you see colonial possessions in 1930, but you also see armed resistance to colonial rule. Right? And so all you have to do is you have to look at the key there, and then you see where were the spots of armed resistance going on in Africa. And now then, let's start to think about what does the colonization of Africa mean? What precipitated this scramble for Africa? I began with an anecdote from Lawrence Summers' 1991.